Across the channel, we've covered many unusual disappearances, and this time I wanted to find and cover some of them in which the searchers themselves directly express their confusion in regards to oddities and the search surrounding these missing people. Let's begin with the disappearance of Jerry Hayes, who was 5 years old when he disappeared under unusual circumstances from the rugged Rucker Canyon, located in the Chiricahua Mountains during November of 1938. At this time, Jerry was on a hunting camping trip with his parents and he managed to disappear from their sight. What's interesting here is that they weren't actively hunting at the time as far as I can tell, but rather were resting at camp. At some point, both of the parents came to the realization that they'd lost track of Jerry and he just wasn't there anymore, simply reporting that he'd wandered away. What this looked like exactly isn't known. Did Jerry get distracted by something in the forest and wander off to look? Was there an animal or something else nearby that piqued his interest? We'll never know now, but the parents did say that wandering away wasn't a habit of his. The search for Jerry was enormous. A group of 400 enrollees and officers searched vainly in rugged Rucker Canyon last night for Jerry, missing for more than 28 hours. It's important to highlight the fact that this search started quickly within an hour of the disappearance in smaller numbers before escalating as the word spread. Even still, they couldn't find a trace of him. They were calling out but never receiving a reply. As the search progressed, one hypothesis began to gain traction, the idea that Jerry might have been taken. This came up because as numbers began to fill up the search and they poured into the forest in all directions, they never saw or heard anything to indicate that Jerry was there. The father, being quite cryptic, continually said that he felt that Jerry was still here in the area and they just couldn't find him. And he remained adamant about that the whole time while other ideas were being considered and circulating. In any case though, the search continued to escalate and soldiers would be sent in too. Sheriff Pruitt announced today that Major E.W. Grimmer of Fort Huachuca had agreed to transport more than 200 soldiers to Rucker Canyon. At this point, Jerry had been missing for 5 days and hope began to fade because it had been freezing cold every single night. Searchers, including a battalion of soldiers from the fort, wearily continued the search for Jerry without a single clue. The sheriff expressed that there were many teams heading in all directions from the exact spot that he disappeared, and I get the sense that he was quite bewildered at the fact that it had been 5 days and Jerry hadn't been found or any sign of him. It seems that many present felt this way too and started asking questions about just how far he could have possibly gone. This seemed to lead more people to the conclusion that he may have been taken from the area. Various hypotheses were advanced as to the possible fate of the boy, but it was believed he could not have survived the freezing temperatures at night in the rough terrain. The next day, an interesting discovery was made. Footprints identified as Jerry's were found yesterday, and members of the searching party said these were the most encouraging clue located since the hunt began. The prints were about 3 miles from where ranchers reported Saturday they heard a child calling Daddy. That actually reminded me of an incident in the previous video. Cattlemen heard a shout and believed it to be the missing boy, but they couldn't figure out where it was coming from. It was the same kind of situation here too. The source of the calling wasn't found. Leaders of the search for Jerry expressed themselves today completely mystified over the child's disappearance. Sheriff Pruitt said the absence of any signs other than the footprints indicated the possibility someone might have picked him up and took him away. This actually caused some disagreement because there were no other footprints present, meaning that it appeared as though Jerry was alone. Unfortunately, the footprints came to an abrupt end and couldn't be followed any longer. Some of the searchers were vocal about their confusion and were talking about how they had no idea what happened here and that their expectation was that he should have been found already. The fact that the ranchers heard a boy calling for his father seemed to really confuse things too, because the sheriff and others believed that that meant that Jerry wasn't in fact alone, but was with another person who he was calling out to. Unfortunately, as said, the source of the noise wasn't located. At the site of the footprints, over 1,000 searchers scoured the area, but there was no further trace of Jerry. The sheriff was absolutely convinced and maintained that a third party had taken Jerry out of the area. Hundreds of men searching Rucker Canyon and a 50 square mile area surrounding plan to cease a 1-week search today, on the suspicion that he'd been taken. Sheriff Pruitt, coordinating efforts of the small army, was quoted as saying that, "If we don't find the Hayes youngster today, I'll know that he's been hauled out of here in a car." The father refused to give up, continuing to say that he still believed that Jerry was there somewhere and alive. However, days later, Forest Service workers would make the discovery. Jerry Hayes' body was reported found 1.5 miles from Buckskin Canyon Saddle. The discovery climaxed the search by nearly 1,000 men. Sheriff Pruitt, who'd been wrong about absolutely everything so far, chimed in. Jerry probably froze and passed away the first night he disappeared. Meanwhile, this was reported immediately after. Jerry Hayes' body was found today, high on a canyon side where he fell exhausted after wandering from his parents' camp. 3 Forest Service workers came upon the boy's body about 4.5 miles from the camp. The body bore only a few scratches. In his wandering, the lost boy climbed approximately 1,000 feet up the canyon side. When the forest workers came across the body, they noted that Jerry was missing his overcoat, but also realised that his shoes were missing. It's often the case that really young people make their way downhill rather than up because it's much easier to travel and they tire quickly while doing this. So it's not clear what was happening here, nor is it really clear how long he lasted. Some searchers were of the opinion that Jerry was probably travelling for a couple of days before reaching his final location, while the sheriff believed that he passed away the first night. An official cause of passing either wasn't determined or wasn't reported because I could find no further articles on this, and it was never stated. Though based on what was said, I lean towards the idea that it perhaps wasn't because of the fall. The point was made that the only injuries he'd sustained were scratches, so exposure probably played a more important role. Unfortunately though, there are no real answers, and given that was the end of the paper trail, let's move on and explore the next disappearance. Pearl Turner was 3 years old when she disappeared in the wilds of White Oak Mountain, located in Arkansas. Pearl was the daughter of a mountaineer farmer, and as such, they lived in a very rural area bordering wilderness on every side. It was never made clear exactly how she vanished, but from reading the articles, I get the impression that she was playing just outside of their home at the time. The story was picked up by the press a few days into the search, and we have to get bizarre almost immediately. A weary army of 800 men renewed their search efforts today to find Pearl Turner. The discovery late yesterday of footprints at a point where members of the searching party declared that they had been several times during the past 2 days served to strengthen the belief in the idea that she had been taken by a third party. The fact that they believed that they'd found her footprints in an area that they'd already searched multiple times perhaps is unusual enough. But what I find peculiar is the reasoning that somehow that means that she'd been taken. I'd note that again, similar to Jerry's disappearance, no other footprints were mentioned, or any evidence that would lead to the belief that she wasn't alone. So, I'm not sure how you go to finding her lone footprints in an area that they'd already searched, to then saying that she'd been taken. I can see how this discovery might have confused people present, but why on earth you'd come to the conclusion that she'd been taken, as opposed to thinking, oh wow, she must have just been here recently, I don't understand. Am I missing something obvious, or am I wrong in thinking this way? The group followed the footprints for 100 yards where the trail was lost. Small bands of men were then sent in all directions, but no further trace of Pearl was found. Again, similar to Jerry, the search parties fully expected to find further evidence of her presence after the footprints. Perhaps it's because they didn't that led them to believe that she'd been removed from the area. Pearl, who disappeared from her home a week ago, has baffled a group of 300 men for 5 days. The search, virtually, has been abandoned. The search didn't actually end there, but I can fully understand why the searchers expressed their confusion here. After finding the footprints, they must have thought, where in the world could she possibly be? How far could she have gotten? And despite all of their efforts, they weren't finding a single thing. The greatest human comb known to the backwoods will be drawn through the wilds of White Oak Mountain tomorrow in an effort to locate Pearl, the modern Little Red Riding Hood. Spaced at 10-foot intervals, the human line of 500 men will march into the dense woods at dawn and sweep the forest for her. Small bands of mountaineers rove the woodland in search of Pearl, but without avail. Not the slightest trace of her was found, and despair again gripped the hearts of the weary searchers as the 6th day of the hunt ended without avail. It seems at this point the authorities were becoming desperate for answers, and they went on what I can only describe as an arrest spree. The sheriff picked 5 individuals, who I suppose must have been near the general area at the time, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense, and then arrested them, stating that it would help clear up the mystery. However, after the questioning, law enforcement came to the conclusion that none of them had anything to do with this and changed their stance to the idea that she must have perished in the forest. Meanwhile, as this was going on, the weather took a turn for the worse during the search and heavy rains brought it to a crawl. These were the final words I could find on this incident. Officials in the Scott County Mountains are without a single clue as to what became of Pearl. Although hundreds of men have searched every crag and nook of the mountains. The 5 persons arrested have been released and absolved of all suspicion of having taken Pearl, and officials again incline to the belief that she has perished. The search continued for a while after this, but Pearl was never seen again. The only clue that was ever found was the little footprints that were believed to belong to her, which were discovered in an area that had already been searched multiple times. So the question remains, what happened to Pearl and where did she go? This next disappearance is a little different, though managed to baffle the searchers nonetheless. In April of 1962, a group of 3 friends, scouts, hikers and cave explorers all at university together, disappeared on Lookout Mountain in northwest Georgia. Specifically, William, James and Martin had planned to do some hiking and cave exploration together in this area, and that's where they came across Case Cave. Thankfully, these individuals had the sense to tell family the general area that they were going to explore, and when they were reported missing around the 20th of April, their car was found parked a short distance from the cave. Civil defense officials said Monday they would use bloodhounds, skin divers and a helicopter in a renewed search for the 3 college students feared lost in a treacherous, muddy mountain cave. 3 teams of experienced explorers probed the inner depths of the cave, but failed to come up with a single piece of evidence as to the whereabouts of the missing trio. This was interesting because they were fairly certain that the 3 had entered the cave, because each of their jackets were found near the entrance. Veteran search leaders said they were baffled by the lack of physical evidence that the 3 were lost in the vast Case Cave. The only real clues to the presence of the 3 were the jackets in the mouth of the cave and the car parked nearby. An experienced team of cave explorers from Atlanta entered the cave early this morning and began a thorough search. The head of the search group, who had explored the cave many times, said, "I don't see how an experienced cave explorer could get lost in this cave." The search leader was making the point that the cave itself was rather linear in the sense that there weren't many branching paths, and the ones that were present didn't extend very far before you'd have to turn back. At the opposite side of a 200-foot lake, the searchers found some gum wrappers and some footprints in the general area. This caused some disagreement, as many were convinced that this meant that the three must have been there, but the search leader said, "I don't think the tracks mean much. Things remain in a state of preservation in a cave like this, and they could have been made 10 years ago." He also reasoned that the wrappers could have been there for some time. Interestingly enough, there were various teams in this cave at all times, and they scoured it in turns. They searched and researched every nook and cranny of the cave, but they weren't finding them. The searchers themselves expressed a lot of confusion here because they just couldn't understand where they'd gone. To them, they had explored every area within the cave multiple times. They'd quite literally had various teams go over the same areas to make sure that they weren't missing anything. This led to calls for searching outside the cave too, reasoning that they were also there to hike. Perhaps they got bored in the cave and then went on hiking instead. The one thing that kept a focus on the cave was the fact that their jackets have been left in the entrance. I suppose they couldn't really come up with a good explanation as to why they just leave them there and go off somewhere else without either wearing them or at least putting them back in the car. It's a good thing this conversation took place. 3 college students spent more than 60 hours huddled on a tiny ledge carved from mud in a treacherous mountain cave before they were found. They were located in what is called a mud pack room deep in the heart of Lookout Mountain. James said they wanted to explore 2 big holes deep in the cave. They secured a rope at the top of a mud bank and went on down. We knew there was water down there, but we didn't know how much. I went down first and hit water about chest deep. The others came on down. James then said that they roamed around down there for a while before finding that the water was rising above their heads. We swam about 40 feet and it was getting cold and we started cramping pretty good and we swam on back. We decided it was about time to leave and we started to climb up the sheer cliff by holding onto the rope, but by this time it was pretty slimy. The more we tried to crawl up the rope, the harder it got. It seems that they hadn't considered this very carefully upon their descent into the water. Now that they were soaking wet, mixed with the slimy substance, everything was extremely slippery and they couldn't climb back up using the rope. They carved out a trench to try to keep themselves out of the water. James said that later, Martin made another attempt to climb partway up the rope. We couldn't see him because he was too far above us, but we heard him fall and hit the water. He came to the surface and said that he was alright. He was just lucky that he hit water because there are a lot of jagged rocks in there, so we decided we'd better not try any more of that. This was the reason that it was so difficult to find them. The fraternity brothers who found them found the students in an area bypassed many times by other searchers. The problem being that the running water was very loud while down there and the 3 friends couldn't hear any of the searchers calling out to them. In the end, they were very lucky, and this incident serves as a cautionary tale for others who enjoy exploring these kinds of areas. They didn't have any food left and any number of things could have gone wrong. Because these areas inside the cave were searched over and over again without finding anything, the decision could have been made, and almost was made, to begin searching outside the cave instead. If that's the conclusion they'd have come to, this story would have turned out much differently. Anyway, I wanted to end this video on a more positive note and thought that was interesting. So with that being said, I suppose that now is a good time to end this video and to hand it over to you in the comments below. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please hit the like button, it helps me a lot. And if you didn't, then feel free to leave a dislike. As always, I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. Thanks for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around and disappearing on the screen. I hope that you've had a great day, or evening depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.